Hello everyone, Jeremy, Mark, Andy, Fergus may join us. These are the other Nightingale Village architects, some of them. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that this building, the entire village, the streets exist on Wurundjeri land and it was never ceded. I'm going to talk about Nightingale Village, but first, how did we get there? In 2015, me and a bunch of Commons residents engaged a crazy young planner called Andy Fergus to fight a pretty horrific development which kind of borrowed amenity from the sides of the streets. Shortly after that permit being granted, the developer put that permit up for sale, or the site up for sale, and I called a bunch of Nightingale architects, brought them into our office and we said, how about we do this together? And so we thought, let's do it with more than one hand. It's 6 k's north of the city. It was kind of a strangely beautiful but desolate site. And essentially when we started this, it wasn't one author doing some big spaceship that landed on the site. It was 7 authors, 7 architects, plus a great urban designer and a great kind of urban thinker, and some great landscape architects. We're going to talk about, really briefly, which is that through this process we ended up negotiating with the City of Moreland to take out this north side of the site and turn it into a park, and Maynard and Nolan had to give up their site. So it ended up being 6 projects throughout the village. Our approach to the precinct was pretty simple. Like the standard process in Brunswick is to cover 100% of your site and pump it up as much as you can. We kind of carved out these connections, east-west, and pulled our buildings back. We pulled out from the bike path to provide some relief to the bike path. And then we brought all the cars in off Hope Street to liberate Duckett Street from cars. So we've got a share car hub for 15 share cars, and then shared bicycle parking above that on the mezzanine. All of the ground planes then, once we liberated Duckett Street from cars, means they could all be active, all active edges. The street wall said that we had to go to about 12 metres, 3 stories. Then it called for this DDO 18 range setback. And we worked with the City of Moreland to say, if we're going to give back in these other moments of urban generosity, that we should be able to encroach on that DDO 18 setback. We then talked about putting all of the bedrooms inboard. Shit, that's me, mate. I'm going to race through this before I hand over to you. But all the bedrooms are inboard. Wherever possible, all the living rooms are outboard to provide passive surveillance. And then we salt and peppered 20% social housing, the first time Nightingale's ever done that, throughout the entire precinct. We took out all the gas, we made sure it was 7.5 stars, and we used great architects. And through all of that, we tried to keep the price down.
So the thing I think that makes it, or we think that makes it an urban project, in addition to being a multi-area project and a project about city making, is the fact that it uses private land and private capital to make amenity and generosity in the public realm. And the engine of that generosity is this notion of the shared car hub. So under 3 of the buildings is a shared basement for cars. Those 3, that garage is accessed through 1 other building. So there's only 1 crossover for notionally 7 buildings. And what that means is that the whole precinct can get access to 25 go-get cars. That basement also houses precinct-based services that feed the whole of the entity. There's a physical design in that garage, but there's also a feasibility design where the architects who weren't burdened by the capital cost of this paid some of their money from their feasibility study to those who were. So it was kind of another act of generosity and sharing. And then when you fold the ground plane back on, you get a really interesting and peculiar spatial hierarchy, and that's driven by the arrangement of the garage. So no crossovers, no cars through here means that cars can stop at this point of Duckett Street, and this becomes liberated from anything to do with vehicles. And that setting back of the rear boundaries that Jeremy talked about sets up a spatial hierarchy where you have a normal street, a residential muse.
30 seconds.
Oh no, we've still got, we're not even 5 minutes yet, Sandy.
Okay.
Because I went for 2.5, he's got 2.5.
Okay.
In that case, sorry, ground plane. Then that spatial hierarchy allows commercial tenancies to trade off each other, and then the notion of residential access and activation and exchange on those new spaces. So this is the Duckett Street, this notion of a sittable threshold without any services or crossovers. Also, Duckett Street, the idea of the sort of wounded asphalt liberated by cars, and the residential use with direct access onto the street. Services are all on Hope Street where that one crossover is, and there's an innovation here where they're linked together via a piece of land that was bought on Duckett Street to act as a services tunnel.
It's your time, mate. It's time for Andy.
And Fergus.
Perfect. One of the really key things about this project was the autonomy of each architect's opportunity to design their own Nightingale whilst orchestrating that within an ensemble that had an intent about it. And so in starting off the project, there was a really significant collaboration around determining the design guidelines that each architect would work with, but rather than an externally imposed set of regulations, it was very much a collective exercise. So design guidelines were written, concepts were presented, and this series of workshops took place at Kennedy Nolan's office, which were incredibly vigorous discussions, really teasing out these relationships between each of the buildings which were being designed concurrently. So in preparing the guidelines, there was a really strong focus on articulating kind of a series of scales in the building around the human scale first, spend your money where it matters, where it's touchable, more robust kind of podium, and this lightweight upper treatment, somewhat in response to the planning controls, but also celebrating the possibility of that. So this little diagram and a series of guidelines became a provocation around a lightness and ephemerality, a sittable plinth so that every single building could function outside of business hours and not require consumption to use the street. And this has actually resulted in reality, not just in the Tom Ross photography. And it's a really important part of the street as an urban room. So you see this resolution of the floodplain, a really significant challenge for a lot of buildings across Melbourne now, how that floodplain and ramp could be handled in a way that produced these sittable plinths on the edge of the building was a really significant component of the building's contribution to the street.
Yeah, you've got one.
In terms of the street wall, there's this really strong approach about mass and strength in the base. This is also about privacy, where the buildings are only 12 metres apart. So you can see this depth and shadow created to augment that quite narrow streetscape, to create that sort of generosity to the urban room, which will become really apparent when you visit. And the height of the ground plane is also a really key part of that. 1.5+ stories for the base, so you're always getting this sense of overscale ground plane in a tight urban realm. The upper levels, this ephemerality, this lightness above the ground plane allows this kind of quite tight urban realm to start to feel more generous. And this articulation of the skyline, not an apologetic setback for planning, but actually a celebration of the sky, these urban rooms which are a secondary communal or public realm for the residents of the village. And these spaces are lightweight, they're designed carefully to protect from solar. There's a lot of lessons from the Commons and Nightingale around this to ensure that we get good weather protection. Greening was really key, not elaborate green facades, high cost maintenance, but really having this opportunity for vegetation to grow and celebrating how residents would contribute to that. The upfield corridor was limited by a derailment barrier requirement.
That's it, guys.
That's
Yep.
it.